Language and music are quite different things. Remember how, in the very first lecture, we saw that the auditory cortex, just above our ears, makes instant decisions as to which sounds are going to be processed as language and which as music. That's how fundamental the distinction is. Language is not necessarily words. There are peoples across the world who have developed so-called whistle languages to communicate across long distances, across town, between remote meadows and even in mountainous areas. They have to because words cannot travel very far. The consonants, such as K, P, R, S, or indeed V and W, are all but impossible to hear already at the distance of one street block. They're virtually silent to begin with. And unless you're an opera singer, it will require enormous effort to make your vowels audible to someone who is vaguely visible in the distance. But high-pitched whistle sounds take little energy to produce and can be deafening already to people beside you. Here's an example of whistle language in the Mexican province of Oaxaca.
Ya, Nisme, Nasma, niño. El mazateco chiflado nace a través de la necesidad de comunicarnos a grandes distancias. Puede ser de un cerro a otro cerro, pero para chiflar distancias largas la persona tiene que usar otro chiflido, es como decir, es muy espontáneo para nosotros. Inclusive ahorita puedo hacer un chiflido hacia mi primo que se encuentra allá afuera, sin verme me puede contestar. Es,
So in this case, in the absence of words, it's pure intonation that has to do the talking. This kind of wordless speaking by intonation uses no musical pitches, let alone a well-organized scale of pitches. And there is no rhythm or beat. I don't personally hear it as music, but I do immediately recognize it as language. On the other hand, when there are words, intonation is no longer essential. In fact, it is all but dispensable. You can either recite in a totally monotonous voice, or you can speak like Jar Jar Binks. The text will be the same either way. If the element of intonation is freed up in this way, music can seize it and use it for its own musical purposes. That's when you sing. Singing doesn't hinder the meaning of language, or at least it doesn't have to. And so with music and lyrics, it's like you get the best of both worlds. Music does tend to get carried away a little. In the first week we talked about melismas and about melismatic chant, in which the melody leaves the syllable far behind and soars into a realm of pure melody beyond all words. In polyphony, the obvious example of melismatic music is the motet Salve Regina by John Brown, also mixed number 33. You see here the page spread in the original manuscript, copied around 1500. By the way, what an unfortunate name for a composer to have, John Brown. He is without question the greatest English composer around 1500, and yet will never be able to write his biography, for as soon as you start searching for him in archival documents, the name John Brown turns out to be all over the place. No way to decide who is the real John Brown. John Brown is one of the great masters of Renaissance sweetness. He doesn't like his music to be too wordy, too talkative. Too many words will only diminish the free-floating sound of his composition. He was, of course, totally successful in safeguarding a sweet triadic sound, seemingly making it last forever. Remember the last word of this motet, Salve, which starts more than a minute and a half before the end of the work. Well, here is the notated music for the top part, that stratospheric soprano, and look at that syllable sal, where the blue arrow lights up. From there to the finish line, the musicians do nothing but sing their hearts out, sounding endlessly just on that one syllable. All English composers around this time loved creating such endless polyphony. It was the English style of the time. And one of the composers in this very choir book gives an important clue to the idea that inspired this style. His name is Robert Wilkinson. If you go to the manuscript spread of his colossal Salve Regina, you'll see 9 colorful images painted within the margin of the music, 5 on the left and 4 on the right. These are the initial letters. The artist takes the first letter of the text, gives it an ornate shape, and provides decoration around it. Each initial marks the beginning of one voice part. That is why the letter inside each initial is S for Salve. So this is indeed a motet in 9 voice parts. Amazing. Once again, it suggests an almost unbridled indulging in sound for its own sake. The reason for the number 9 becomes obvious when we look closer at the initials. There's 3 angels within each letter S, and each of these groups holds a scroll which presumably contains the music. But the side of the scroll that is turned to us has just one word in red. I have printed these words in translation beneath each image. Seraphim, cherubim, thrones, dominations, virtues, powers, principalities, archangels, and the angels. These are in fact the 9 angelic choirs which, in the Christian tradition, are singing without ceasing, endlessly, eternally, to render musical praise to God in heaven. That is the image that seems to have inspired the idea of a never-ending sweetness, a sweet sound not held back by words, but lasting forever. In the case of John Brown's motet, Awesome Mix number 33, the words are addressed to the Virgin Mary. Some idea of how she was thought to be worshipped in heaven can be gleaned from this oil painting, made perhaps as little as 10 or 20 years before the motet. The angels nearest to Mary are singing. Those further away have brought musical instruments. What they offer is a constant, perennial musical tribute, for that is the appropriate thing to do, to give the celestial divine beings the best you can offer. And that is how composers like Brown and Wilkinson viewed their work as musical composers. They saw it as their task to offer the heavenly company the summit they were capable of, and nothing less. That is what music worship was for. But if we now leave England and cross the Channel into mainland Europe, we're stepping in a world that is completely alien to this way of thinking, which emphasizes sober frugality over lavishness, and seems concerned with restraint rather than effusiveness. The key figure, and the name you'll have to remember for the midterm exam, is a composer named Josquin des Prez. We have a woodcut image of him, for he was included, with portrait and all, in a book devoted to the famous artists, intellectuals, scientists, authors, political rulers of his time. So here on this page we find his image right beneath that of Leonardo da Vinci. For a composer, such fame is quite extraordinary, especially since the book was printed nearly a century after his death. Josquin must have been regarded as one of the greatest artists of all time. When we now zoom in on his face, we cannot help noting his conspicuous fashion statement, a huge turban-like piece of headgear known at the time as chaperon. These chaperons were a sign of wealth and affluence, and they were often of a blindingly red fabric. People who had themselves painted with one usually made sure to wear a fur-trimmed gown and jewelry on their fingers as well. They may not always have realized that their face was bound to lose the competition for the visually most interesting part of the painting. That risk may have existed with Josquin as well. The woodcut was based on an oil portrait of the composer, now lost. And if everything was to scale, then Josquin must have been wearing one of the largest chaperons of the century. I point this out because each portrait has its own story to tell. What we see here is a man of great confidence and self-possession, keen to impress and not afraid to look us straight in the eye. Everything we know about Josquin confirms that he was endowed with a healthy sense of self-esteem. Undoubtedly, he would have been pleased to hear what it says in the caption to his woodcut portrait, namely that he has beautiful eyes. Awesome Mix number 34 is the most famous composition by Josquin and one of the most famous work of the whole Renaissance altogether. There's no way you can teach a music appreciation course without at least acknowledging its existence. And it has to be said, it is a pretty remarkable work, extremely well composed. You could really say it is a statement on the art of composition. But it is also a statement about how music and lyrics can tighten their relationship to an unbreakable bond. Let's listen to the beginning. After the motet by John Brown a while ago, the first thing that stands out more than anything else is the utter frugality, economy, concision of the thing. It feels as if there is not one note too many, and the piece unfolds in the most tightly controlled fashion. Have a listen. One of the strange things about this first page is that about half of it consists of silence. The top part sings only 1/3 of the time, alto 40%, tenor 50%, and then, goodness me, the bass can stay silent for nearly 2/3 of the page. No wonder that the piece is so transparent and gives the impression that there is indeed not one note too many. There really isn't one. In this screen we can see why. Josquin's motet begins with imitation, and nothing but imitation. If you put dotted line boxes around each motive, then the only bit that is not motive is the top part, the last 3 measures of the page. See the green arrow. Now all this seems a little strange. Palestrina began his career with a beautiful point of imitation in richly flowing counterpoint. But once a voice had entered, it kept running for the rest of the movement. That is what was so satisfying about it. It only got richer, never poorer. But in Josquin the motives are stated, and then there is nothing, at least not until the next motive. This is going to have an effect on sweetness. You cannot create triadic sound with less than 3 voices. But does Josquin ever have that many voices sound at the same time on this page? Let's listen again. And now I'm going to fill in the measures with pink color if they have full triadic sonority. No pink shades at all. That is a disappointing result if you love triadic sonorities of the Renaissance as much as I do. But it is in a way a trade-off. You've lost sonority, but you have gained in textual clarity. These text phrases are all wonderfully lucidly enunciated. It's like there's 4 people talking to you, but patiently and in orderly fashion, and you have no difficulty understanding them. For me, the question at this point is not whether the trade-off is worth it, but simply the fact that it was made. If we now turn to the next page, we see that there are still quite a lot of rests in various voices. On the other hand, there are also some passages where all 4 voices sound at once. It has taken so much to get to this point that you would think 4-part writing in a 4-part motet is a big deal, until you realize that you could also simply start with all 4 voices at once, and then everybody has something to sing right away. This comparison alone tells you that Josquin wants to pare down his compositional means so drastically that even a tiny gesture in one voice or another can appear like a dramatic statement. Let's see how this second page evolves. Now, we saw a clear example of a tiny gesture at the point where the cadence fell. The bass takes his time to join the other voices in the final chord, and in fact he doesn't reach his own final note until the next measure. This tiny gesture has the effect of weakening the cadence. And by weakening it, Josquin lets us know that we should expect more to come. And indeed, that is just what happens. A new phrase, ave cuius conceptio. It could not have been stated more clearly. Josquin states the same phrase, first in the top 2 parts, then in the bottom 3 parts. This is the art of composition, as exemplified in the masterful way by Josquin around 1500. I'm saying masterful not as an empty commonplace I've somehow repeated from the textbook, but because I can truly appreciate the craftsmanship behind this, at least in an objective way. At the same time, and I'm sorry to say this, the piece has always somehow felt distant to me. It wants to be admired from a distance. It doesn't draw me in. That does happen sometimes, that all the textbooks tell you that piece X or Y is great, and for some reason it has always failed to excite me. But now, in the vein of objective appreciation, let's continue where we left off and follow Josquin's path to another cadence that is much stronger and yet still not fully conclusive. Once again, there is one voice which breaks the unity. But in the climb towards the cadence, you'll see that the voices push and push up. The top note reaches a peak, and then all voices descend to the cadence. Now, we can also recognize another new device used by Josquin. He deliberately started his composition by not giving triadic sonority for the whole first page. Then he did introduce it, but sparingly, steadily allowing the effect to be accumulated. Now you see on these pages that he has saved up the 4-part texture for these moments in particular. That is compositional planning, and that is the art of composition. So controlled is the pacing of the motet that Josquin can afford to conclude it with 3 simple phrases in 4-part counterpoint. Between the second and third phrase falls the final cadence, in the longest note values you've heard up to this point. Now, to summarize all this, let's look at the passages once again, but now schematically, in a diagram. You could well say that this music is generated by a few motives, each treated in strict imitation, with more compact choral statements towards climactic passages. But those motives and choral passages in their turn seem to be generated by the text itself. It is as if the text phrases dictate the kind of music that will show them in their best, or at least most lucidly audible and intelligible. So the difference between John Brown and Josquin des Prez could scarcely be more dramatic. Within the same basic contrapunct rules, they manage to cultivate musical styles that are each other's opposites. What makes the contrast even more striking is the fact that the pieces are so similar in other respects. Most importantly, both are prayers to the Virgin. They both address the Virgin directly, speak to her, and only to her and nobody else. So why would two composers use such completely different musical styles to do the same thing, which is to pray for her mercy and intercession, at around the same point in history? It all depends on what you think is the aim of Christian worship. From one point of view, the Virgin is the Queen of Heaven. That would make Christian believers her subjects, and subjects are beholden to pay appropriate reverence and honor to their sovereign. And by appropriate I mean commensurate with the dignity of a heavenly queen. Of course, nothing humans can produce could ever be good enough for the Virgin Mary, so one might as well give up right away. But in the case of John Brown, it is obvious that he is giving the very best he can offer, even knowing that it cannot match the dignity of its recipient. If he seems indifferent to text, in the sense that he can make one syllable last about a minute and a half, it is because any word or syllable or even letter will be more impressive the more ornately it is presented. In the case of Josquin, on the other hand, there is such frugality, such economy, such sparing use of musical resources, that you might almost wonder if he had more than pocket change to spare for the Virgin Mary. But that is how it will sound in direct comparison with John Brown. But let's regard his setting on its own terms. First of all, Josquin clearly did not regard musical sweetness as the very best thing he could offer to the Virgin. Sure, he knew how to produce it. He could open the tap of sweet triadic sonority just as well as the next person. So when he pointedly doesn't, and when on the first page alone his voices are silent about 50% of the time, you can tell that there is something else that he considers more important. We have seen that this is the words, the text. It is for these, for their intelligibility, that he trades in musical sweetness. You could almost imagine a dialogue between Josquin des Prez and John Brown, in which they reflect on their respective compositional choices. At this point, it's like Josquin would say, "Well, if you are going to offer a prayer to the Virgin Mary, the least you can do is to show that you're serious about it, that you really mean what you're saying. Make an effort to be articulate, present the text phrases with clear rises and falls, and end them with the appropriate cadences at the appropriate points. Don't leave it to the Virgin to pick out the syllables from that colossal wash of sound you splash all over her." John Brown: "Look, Josquin, don't worry. The Virgin Mary gets it. She's no dummy. You don't have to speak to her like she's a foreigner who won't understand English unless you overpronounce it with ridiculously demonstrative facial gestures. That's not being humble, and it is not being appropriately reverent." Josquin: "But how can you know that you're serious about your prayer when you treat the words as an excuse for endless vocalizing on empty vowels? That's completely self-indulgent, and the opposite of humble." John Brown: "She will know that I'm serious because I present the words in sounds of such sweetness and with such artful melodic embroidery as no person in history has ever heard. It will be a joy for her to hear the words, just for the sound alone. On the other hand, what pleasure is she to take from an emaciated skeleton like your motet? If the meaning of the words is all that matters, then why not write them down on a piece of paper and give that to her?" The issues I've illustrated in this dialogue took on even sharper form when the question of musical worship in church began to be considered from another angle. What are individual makers to make of music? What do they get out of it, if anything at all? What spiritual benefits can they draw from a motet like that of John Brown, or like that of Josquin? It's on this point that it may be helpful to show you another page spread from the textbook, pages 58 and 59, entitled In Divine Service. It's all about the Reformation and Counter-Reformation in 16th century Europe. Now, this is not the point to turn this lecture into a history lesson, but the great religious conflicts of this period did have a huge impact on musical practice, and especially on the question how text is to be treated musically. Reform is not in itself a controversial term. It means to review the current state of things and to make improvements where necessary. Around 1500, nobody in Europe was in doubt that the Catholic Church needed reform. The problem was how to achieve that without escalation. In the end, escalation could not be avoided, and that is where reform turned into reformation. It started innocuously enough, one day in 1517, when a monk and theologian walked up to this church in the German town of Wittenberg and hammered a sheet with 95 proposals for church reform on the door. His name was Martin Luther, and you see his 95 proposals there on the left, as they were to be printed in a pamphlet later on. It had been his intention to improve the church, not to escalate conflict. But that is what happened. The following video clip shows this in condensed form, and it is useful to include that clip here, if only because it underlines the enormous impact of printing on the spread of ideas, in this case, Luther's ideas.
12 of Mainz, Father in Christ and most illustrious Prince, forgive me that I should dare to write to you. I make bold because it is my duty to serve you and to warn you of the crooked practices of those who claim to represent your grace. Christ did not command the preaching of indulgences, but of the gospel.
Forward this to Rome.
Christians are to be taught that he who gives to the poor or lends to the needy does a better deed than he who buys indulgences.
If the Pope can empty purgatory, why would he not do so out of love rather than for money?
My God, who is this Martin Luther?
Fritz?
What? Dr. Luther wanted everyone to see that.
And everyone will.
Reform becomes reformation when a sizable part of Europe breaks from the Catholic Church and builds its own church, not by following the example of Rome, but by rethinking every part of what it means to be a Christian church, and that includes church music. Reformers did not typically think of music in worship as an offering to God. Their first concern was with the spiritual benefit of the congregation. So the question was not how to create the most splendid music to offer to the Supreme Being, but rather how best to help individual believers on the path towards salvation. And this, they felt, is where Catholics had failed. They had turned the church into a theatre, a place where the faithful came to behold and admire spectacular musical performances by the most celebrated professional musicians of the time. It might be pleasing to God, but what kind of lesson or message or insight was the individual worshipper supposed to take home from all this? What reformers found especially troubling is that such elaborate church music made it impossible to hear the words, let alone understand them. So those words flew over the heads of the congregation, like so many seeds blown in the air away from the fertile soil. Bearing all this in mind, it was only natural to insist that church music should never obscure the words, nor make them unintelligible, nor distract attention away from them, but should at all times render the text clearly and lucidly. By the same token, church music should be sung in the vernacular. What good was Latin to the average churchgoer if they understood it no better than we understand the Shiriwook of Chewbacca? On the Catholic side, similar criticisms of church music could be heard as well. The Counter-Reformation is the Catholic response to the Reformation, undertaking its own review of established practices and deciding what scope there might be for improvement. It took 18 years for the Catholic Church to complete that process in the so-called Council of Trent. Legend has it that no one less than Palestrina was involved in some of the events that took place at this council. As one might expect, there were opposing views about the utility of music among the assembled bishops and cardinals. For the most extremist prelates, the question now became, do we even need music in church? What is it good for? What benefit do the faithful derive from it? Why not do away with music altogether, or at least with the polyphony? The plain chant we can keep, for that goes back to Pope Gregory the Great. An argument frequently heard among the extremists was that music is, at bottom, nothing but sound. And when the sounds have died out, music is nothing at all. The way they saw it, musical sound is really no better than a fragrance, a fleeting scent picked up by the nostrils. Pleasing when it's a good odor, but not for that reason more valuable or useful. The fragrance as such has nothing to tell us. It has no message. It's empty. A little breeze will blow it all away, and then what are you left with? Musical sound is just like that, or so they maintain. Never in history has anyone with even a modest claim to culture maintained viewpoints about music as Philistine as this. They are not really even viewpoints so much as empty slogans, whose mere utterance was apparently deemed sufficient to end all discussion. Nothing but sound. You can see the rationale in an invertebrate species kind of way, for when all is said and done, a cathedral is nothing but stone, a book is nothing but ink and paper, and a painting is nothing but pigment smeared on a canvas. This mode of thinking is known as reductionism, and it should be regarded and treated as a form of depression. Anyhow, once this reductionism had locked church music in its crosshairs, the art was virtually defenseless. For what credible answer could it give? And yet there was still one path to rescue. Music's last vestige of utility in church was its association with text. For even if musical sound by itself means nothing, even if it's merely an empty thrill, as meaningful as, say, scratching an itch, then there is still a lot it can do to help us hear and understand text. It can make the words clearly audible, it can project them, enunciate them, and render them intelligible. Had not Josquin demonstrated precisely that? Did the very frugality of his motet not demonstrate that he endeavored to rely as little as possible on that empty thing called sound, and that he instead invested all his compositional ingenuity in the crafting of an abstract formal design? In this way, the art of composition could conceivably vindicate music. The story of Palestrina at the Council of Trent is a story of vindication. Apparently, the voices clamoring for the abolition of all polyphony in church had swelled to such a chorus that the vote on its future could be expected any moment now. There was no time to lose. It had to be possible to demonstrate, even to these extremist hotheads among the cardinals, that it was, after all, possible to have church music that was both polyphonic and a vehicle for clear text declamation. So Palestrina was called upon, at the very last moment, to put together a work of this kind. And that work, or so the story goes, was his Missa Pape Marcelli, number 39 in the awesome mix. No sooner was it performed and heard at the Council of Trent, or even the most inveterate critics of polyphony could not help calling for the continuation of that practice and voted enthusiastically yes, or so the story goes. Palestrina had succeeded single-handedly in saving all church music from an untimely demise in the later 16th century. So let's turn to that Mass. The one section of Missa Pape Marcelli that we have already heard is the Kyrie. Initially, it may not strike us as a setting that would have greatly convinced the music haters of the benefits of polyphony. For one thing, the Kyrie is an item in the Catholic Mass that has very little text to begin with, just Kyrie eleison, Greek for Lord have mercy, and this stated 3 times. The words Kyrie eleison are 6 syllables, so with altogether 3 statements, that comes down to 18 syllables altogether. Now, if Palestrina wanted this text to be clearly audible and intelligible, he could have stated it in 18 simple chords. But he does not. With the help of the art of composition, he turns this Kyrie into a more artful musical work, one that is held together by the device of imitation. But here, just as in the Josquin motet, the art of composition is closely linked with the treatment of text. It may be that there are multiple statements of the same motive, and that they overlap to the point where you cannot clearly distinguish what is said in one voice from what is said in another. Every motive, nevertheless, enters with that same text phrase, Kyrie eleison. So you could look upon this as a group of people, with each individual uttering the prayer when the Spirit moves them. Yet the Kyrie is probably not the movement that would have had the greatest persuasive power at the Council of Trent. For that, we will have to go to the Credo of the same Missa Pape Marcelli, also included under number 39 of the Awesome Mix. Unlike the Kyrie, the Credo is a wordy movement. It is, after all, the statement of all the articles of Orthodox faith in the Catholic Church, that is, all the teaching and doctrines which you will have to affirm as a Catholic believer. One of these I've already mentioned, begotten, not made, genitum non factum, a statement essential to the belief that Christ is a person in the Holy Trinity. It is a fairly short text still, at more than 160 words, though it's quite a feat to be able to condense the core teachings of Catholicism even into a text this short. It's quite a bit shorter even than the Gettysburg Address, for example. The Credo was a fixed item in the daily ritual that was Mass. A regular churchgoer would know the text by heart, just as the English translation is very well known among Anglican believers. With Josquin's motet fresh in our ears, we can immediately recognize the second major compositional device that Palestrina uses in the Missa Pape Marcelli. Essentially, he divides the 6 voices of his choir into different groupings, and uses these voice groupings to differentiate successive phrases of the text. Let's say he has a phrase in which the choral forces are reduced to voices 1, 3, 4, 5, and 6. Once that short phrase is done, a new one starts, but now it will have a different grouping, say voices 2, 3, and 5. It is essential that each grouping is never used for more than one text phrase at a time. There has to be immediate variety. The next phrase should already have a different voice grouping. If you go on like this, stating phrase after phrase of the Credo every time in a new combination of voices, you will get quite a lively movement. The text phrases will be kept clearly apart. This is the very same kind of voice grouping that Josquin applied in his motet Ave Maria Virgo Serena, on the words Ave cuius conceptio. It is important to draw attention to this device in both Josquin and Palestrina, because it will become a compositional goal in its own right in the so-called polychoral style of Gabrieli and other composers in Venice, and that is the subject of Lecture 11. But now, let's listen and enjoy Palestrina's musical setting of the first section of the Credo. There is another feature that this credo setting shares with the compositional style in Josquin's Ave Maria Virgo Serena. It is the frugality, the tendency to use musical resources sparingly. Remember when we looked at that first page of Josquin's motet, and it turned out that the bass alone was silent for almost 2/3 of the page? Well, it is inherent in the use of reduced voice groupings, like those of Palestrina, that each voice spends quite a bit of time being silent. If you tally the total of such silences in each voice, you arrive at the following picture. Once again, it's the bass which has the least amount of work to do. In the first 2 minutes of the credo, it spends about 40% of the time being silent. The top part is the opposite. It is most actively involved in the largest number of voice groupings. Voices 2, 3, 4, and 5, on the other hand, are all silent for a little less than 1/3 of the time. It is perhaps not quite the frugality we have seen in Josquin, which was exceptional already for its own time. But it does once again underline the intimate connection between the art of composition and the treatment of text in polyphony. Up to this point, we have considered mainly the ways in which text imposes form on music. The text phrases seem to generate motives, or they demarcate musical phrases, each with their own voice groupings, and the musical rhythms are often adjusted to match the metric stresses and durations of the lyrics. But all that is indeed about form. Yet texts can also have emotional content. They can sing about things that may move the listener. And if the listener is not readily moved, then music can offer assistance in underlining the emotional core of the text. In the course of the 16th century, it becomes ever more important for music to become a vehicle for emotional expression, to convey to us the changing moods and states of mind of the person speaking. All this will come to a head in the development of a musical genre whose very premise is that music should depict a text, or convey its mood, or express the speaker's sentiment, or move the listener emotionally. That genre is the madrigal. And in the late 16th century, it will prove to be the central catalyst in the sudden breakthrough of a new musical idiom. I will come back to that soon. However, to illustrate the task music was called upon to play in the setting of emotionally charged texts, let us now turn to item number 35 in the awesome mix. It is the motet Absalon Fili Mi. Absalom, my son, composed by Josquin des Prez not long after the year 1500. The text of this motet is a lament, voiced by King David of the Hebrew Bible, upon the loss of his son Absalom. It's a moment movingly depicted here in the 1956 painting by Marc Chagall. The text of Josquin's motet is a compilation of scriptural passages taken from biblical books as diverse as the book of Samuel, Job, and Genesis. Together they amount to a statement of grief that is all the more powerful for being so pithy. A father is grieving for his son. If only he could have died in his place. And in a way he has died already, or is about to, and he will now descend into the infernal regions. To quote the translation from the slide, Absalom, my son, who could give me to die for you, my son Absalom? I shall live no more, but shall descend in the netherworld, weeping. There is a well-known model of grief posited by the Swiss psychiatrist Elisabeth Kübler-Ross. According to this model, humans typically go through 5 stages in coming to terms with the loss of a loved one. The first is denial. It's like saying Absalom did not die. He can't have. In a moment he'll come walking in, and it will be all like nothing had happened. The second stage is anger. Why did this happen? Why my son of all people and not somebody else? Who did this to me? Then the third stage, bargaining. What if I could have traded his death for something else? I would have given up anything, if only I could have died in his place. But who can make this happen for me? The fourth stage is depression. There is no light beyond this darkness. There never can be any more. There is nothing left to live for. I will die, descend into the netherworld, and never rise again. We find King David firmly in these last 2 stages. There is still the lingering hope that he could somehow have bought off Absalom's death. But when that hope proves futile, nothing remains but the wish to die. The final stage of grief is acceptance. The thought that it is possible to go on living and even to find joy and hope despite the loss. For if you cannot end with a reaffirmation of life, then how was life ever meaningful to begin with? I have drawn attention to these stages of grief because we will soon encounter another figure who will have to come to terms with a grievous personal loss as well. His name is Orpheus, or Orfeo in Italian, the legendary singer of antiquity, who reportedly could move animals, stones, rivers with the power of his song. For some reason, he won't get any further than stage 1, denial. And that already tells you something about the opera of which he is the title character. But more about that later. In his setting of King David's lament, Josquin takes his cue from the last few words of the text. I shall descend into the netherworld weeping. Of all ideas and images, it seems none lends itself as easily to musical depiction as a descent. After all, we have rising and falling scales. We can descend by steps or by leaps or in any other way that we please. But here is the question. How do you musically depict a slow descent? For if you go down the diatonic scale, you're 2 octaves down before you know it, and off the keyboard altogether after a few more seconds. What we need is the 16th century equivalent of the so-called shepherd tone. A shepherd tone is a sound that is constantly rising in pitch, rising and rising and rising, and yet you're never really gaining an altitude. The best example is the endless stairs in Super Mario 64, of which I will now include a clip. And now a second example of a shepherd tone, but now descending. So what we need is a musical effect somewhat like this, a slow and inexorable descent, and yet controlled enough not to lose altitude immediately. The device Josquin uses is really quite simple. It is based first of all on the cadence. Let's take a modern cadence for now. This is known as a dominant tonic cadence. You can recognize it by the leap of a fifth in the bass. With that leap, you arrive at the tonic. Once you've gotten to that point, nothing stops you from treating that chord like it is a dominant in its own turn. The easiest way to do that is to turn it into a so-called seventh chord. Once you have that chord in place, you can complete the second cadence. So what we have just created is a downward progression involving two cadences. The first of the two cadences you see here has been deprived of its cadential effect by treating its final chord as though it were just the beginning of another cadence. Naturally, we can keep going this way, and we can have the effect without necessarily leaving the keyboard. In that regard, it really is a bit like the shepherd tone. We do, however, quickly run out of space on these slides. But if you do extend this process, you will end up with something that is not actually linear, but rather spiral. The process is one that spirals down. And that brings us to Josquin and his motet Absalon Fili Mi. He uses only a portion of this spiral. If you play descending chords in succession, then the downward progression will go very fast. But that is why Josquin in this motet alternately leaps up and down, so that in fact the progression descends very slowly. Having shown this with the help of the keyboard, we can now take a portion of the end of the motet and play it alongside this descending spiral. The motet Absalon Fili Mi is famous not only for its use of this spiral, but because the bass ends on a pitch that is well out of range for most of us lesser mortals. It's a low B flat. Most recordings I know simply transpose up the piece by a fourth. I've also heard one recording in which there was a contrabass softly playing along. But the recording in your awesome mix features Glenn Miller, a so-called basso profundo, for whom this voice part is simply peanuts, as you can tell in this TV interview with him.
What do we call your
Oh,
voice?
my voice?
Yes. It is the...
It's actually called a basso profundo, which means deep, low bass.
Yeah, well,
Yeah,
that
there you
seems
are.
like that's accurate. So give us a really impressive low note here. Oh my gosh. Wow, you could do one of those like the monks doing the chanting.
Oh, yeah, right.
And now we conclude this lecture with a slow descent into the netherworld.